I see the red light. Are we ready to
Oh,
go?
ready. Okay.
Hi, so most of you we've had me hanging around earlier. I'm Richard Urban, faculty here in the iSchool. But actually my colleague, Dr. Therese Graven, is going to lead us off. And I'm actually going to let her do her own introduction because she'll do it better than I probably can. So we're going to be talking today about the Link Women Pedagogues Project, a reflection on DH collaboration and mindsets.
Thank you for having me. I'm out of your field. I'm assuming you're out of mine. So I'm going to just contextualize the project that Richard and I have been doing together. I'm Therese Graven. I'm an associate professor in the Department of English, which at FSU means many different things because it's a fairly diverse department. But I work mainly in histories of rhetoric, feminist theory, and digital humanities, and quite a few projects for me emerge out of that intersection. And one project that has emerged out of that intersection for me has been an examination of the formation and evolution of what I call knowledge economies, women's knowledge economies. I'm very interested in women instructors, program administrators, pedagogues, faculty who might have had very untraditional careers, mobile careers, and so they're very difficult to trace through traditional means and institutional archives. I'm also very interested in how historians tend to proliferate those knowledge economies and sort of shifting our historical practices more towards ephemera, metadata, and memory. So that's probably the most abstract way to talk about what I'm doing, and I have a few slides to talk about this hopefully more concretely. In my own discipline, women's archival representation is pretty flattened, and that's mainly due to an incremental circulation of text since about the 19th century. Sometimes the flattening is caused because they're unlisted co-authors on materials, or they're named only by their initials, or they're named in the acknowledgments, or they were a mentor or an instructor who never really had the opportunity to publish. Sometimes they're in the university collections, but those collections are guided and shaped very closely by the desires of someone else at the university who doesn't quite see the alterity that needs to come out of the archive. And so there's been a real interest in my field since the 1990s, what we refer to as a data deluge and a digital archival turn, in whether the proliferation of digital resources might actually solve this problem. And for us, it's caused more digital dark spaces and more interesting gaps than it has brought things to light. So the questions I've been working at are we actually managing archival abundance, or are we having to contend for new historiographic gaps that are created by false absences and presences of certain records as they appear or don't appear in institutional archives. So one particular question guiding the project that I started working on when Richard met me was, how can we enable the writing of disciplinary histories that better account for the processes by which they get written? So it's very much a historiographic question. Histories that are based on non-artifact oriented ecologies, and histories that are based in archival metadata, and also histories that are based in perceptions of how a field and a discipline get formed. For me, from my vantage point, I feel like I'm walking around in an object-oriented world that assumes archives are built on principles of stability. And so my interest not only is in doing archival work, but also having the archive deconstruct, even as I'm working in it. And that's very natural to a humanist to do those two things at once. For some faculty, especially women faculty in certain disciplines, evidentiary gaps have been a really interesting place for us to look to see how they actually helped to evolve my field. So the various evidences that people in my field are interested in gathering or collecting in an institutional setting are sometimes not the sources that we need to use to do our critical work. So maybe I should just present myself as someone who does have a background in archival processing. It's very common for people in rhetoric to do archival processing, but also comes at it from a very critical orientation where we realize already the archive is a very mobile entity. And we're trying really hard to reach out and find the vocabulary to explain this mobility and how it impacts the disciplinary discussion of disciplinary histories. So I thought maybe what I would do is give you some examples of just some gaps that I'm talking about, because I know it's common for us to sort of talk about these gaps in abstract terms and not give very concrete terms. One kind of gap that I'm interested in investigating is a gap that occurs for women whose careers might escape geographic attention because of where they held certain faculty status. Or where they publish certain work. And Frances Melville Perry has been a really interesting case study for me and some colleagues that I work with. She was born in Indianapolis. She was educated at Butler University and the University of Chicago. She taught at the Indianapolis Training School. She was an instructor of rhetoric at Wellesley for a decade, right at the turn of the 20th century. Then became a full professor and the head of a rhetoric program at the University of Arizona before that discipline had really formed in the Southwest. She wrote 6 textbooks on rhetoric, writing, and argumentation, but her archival presence is actually more directed towards juvenile biographies, an article she wrote in Science where she was actually describing the state of social science education, and a few other very unrelated publications to the field. So when we try to do a digital-only trace for her, or when we try to do an institutional trace, it's very hard to find Perry in the spaces where we would assume to find her, and she's actually not reflected in any field scholarship anywhere at all. So the people have been giving presentations on her at conferences, but she's still not reflected in any field scholarship. She's also not in the MLA faculty list. She's not anywhere where we would look for lists of faculty because she never had tenured status. So, she just makes a really good case study in terms of that kind of geographical mobility. And then another kind of gap occurs for women whose legacy has already been set prior to their entering the field. So Hallie Q. Brown is more commonly remembered as an African-American activist than she is as a mentor, a communication instructor, or a faculty administrator, even though she had a fairly long and well-known career at Wilberforce University. There's an archive there now dedicated to her. She taught throughout the South. She served as lady principal of the Tuskegee Institute. She was the dean of Allen University in Columbia, South Carolina. Then she went back to Wilberforce. And she even has her own entry in the New York Public Library's digital Schomburg collection. So she's not an unknown entity, but nowhere does she ever appear in the disciplinary history in spite of all the courses she developed, all the courses she administered, all the TAs she trained. So she's still sort of known as someone who worked towards temperance and abolition and suffrage, but actually not having a disciplinary presence. And then there are other gaps. I could go on, actually. I could take the whole hour talking about this. But the third kind of gap occurs for those figures who we know only by inference. And so I've been trying really hard to work with Richard to figure out what does it mean to trace inferences, and is there even a data set that exist in the world that helps us see that. They're mentioned, they're cited, they're acknowledged, but those places where they're cited or acknowledged are either out of print, or they're faculty files that go along with collections, but they're not part of accessioned collections. So we're talking about real ephemeral mentions. They also might have had para or cross-disciplinary appointments, so no department claims them, so no departmental archive necessarily has a good, stable record of them. I started to realize this is actually a big problem for my field, because through the 1910s and teens, there were a lot of unnamed teachers of rhetoric who were just listed in these extra departmental directories as being just contingent faculty. And it's very hard to sort of match up the identities because they're listed only by their initials. So there's archival uptake and archival accretion that in my field we have no way of tracking, and I've been trying to think about what mechanism we need to sort of study that uptake and understand that archival accretion. So in response to that problem, rhetorical historians often look outward and say, okay, well, we need tools, we need digital tools, or methodologies that better reflect the beliefs we have about how mobile this influence is. And also an understanding of what intellectual capital is tied to different kinds of archival accretion. And so that's where a lot of my interest has been, in sort of theorizing and developing these tools for results and also for inquiry. So in 2010, I began developing very basically a project that was eventually called MidMap, the Metadata Mapping Project. It was intended to be an experimental prototype that might approach that question. And then eventually I began envisioning the prototype as a series of very awkward wireframes and a very basic WordPress blog. To develop it further, then I sent queries, I conducted informal focus groups, I distributed a survey among leaders of two of my organizations, Rhetoric Society of America and the Coalition of Feminist Scholars in the History of Rhetoric, and then talked with several archivists whom I had been collaborating with over several years to get their sense of what information they thought was available but underutilized, and also to get a sense of what their research needs were that they thought a tool like this could actually help fulfill. And it seemed that many RetComp historians had been accumulating different forms of data, but they were uncertain of how to use the data they'd gathered. They didn't know what scholarly products could come out of it. They certainly couldn't publish it in the form that they collected it in. They might have been collecting spreadsheets where they were doing very close reading of women as they were mentioned in textbooks. They might have looked at archival finding aids with very obscure references to people who were not actually reflected in the accession papers but were related to the collection. They might have looked at faculty files with lists of non-tenure track women instructors. There were lots of ways they were collecting data, but not in a very systematic way. And so my question shifted to, how do we write more nuanced histories of women in rhetorical education when their landmarks move and when we don't even have a sense of how to systematically gather that data and stabilize it? And then what scholarly products would come out of it for us? So Richard and I started talking about some of these questions. I'm actually just showing you some pages from the MidMap prototype. We started, I think, in 2013 and 2014 talking about this. Richard actually became an advisor on the MidMap site and eventually led me to gravitate toward his own work in linked open data and people-based information architecture. And we began to have a broader vision for the MidMap as something that could represent a way of doing history that understood sort of the mobile aspects of history as networks of uncertainty. So I had also come at this from an interest in networks, and we identified shared interests in that and in various ways that information sources might or might not represent that kind of shared work. And then we officially started collaborating on this project, the Link Women's Pedagogue Project, in 2015, I think 2015. And the project has since evolved into our plans to construct a bigger knowledge base. And so I think we're really in phase 1 in terms of doing some, putting out a research protocol and doing some participant research to figure out what could phase 2 and phases beyond look like. And so we'll be focusing on some aspects of that shared project today. But one of the interesting challenges that has come out of working together on this is, from my vantage point, is our reliance on different paradigms. So, what is a paradigm? How does it work? How should it inform the work we do? How should it inform the information architecture? How should it inform the tool? How should it determine our attitudes towards construction of anything we do? And so this has actually led to, I think, our richest conversations, because feminist historiography in my field tends to resist anything that acts like a modernist hierarchy. It tends to resist the idea that project construction is done following the same discrete tasks each time. And so it also tends to move towards interstitial recovery, which is still a fairly under-theorized practice. What does it mean to look in the interstices, and how do you know that this is an interstice and not an object? So for us, in my field, the recovery process is often not linear. It's often very antilinear. It's tied up with multiple agents. And so I think that those differences have actually just led to the most productive conversations in this project and led to some really wonderful, frank discussions about mindsets. So I think at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Richard and give him my mic.
Sound okay? Right, so at the time that I encountered the project in Therese, I was already sort of coming off my dissertation and getting started on some other work here, where I was already thinking about the idea of mindsets, and particularly mindsets within our own field. Right, as we're moving towards linked data and other ways of representing bibliographic information in the bibliographic universe, trying to think about how is it that we think about the way we go about this work ourselves, and what kinds of opportunities there are as we move towards these other kinds of approaches. Right, and I just love this graphic. I use this in my class too, talking about some of this stuff of thinking about how our perspective, our mindset, also distorts the way we see certain kinds of ways of representing data. So this is just some examples of in sort of exploring what was available to us. So this is sort of an example of a record from the MidMap project, and then some of the kinds of scholarly note-taking spreadsheets that are available. And right, many of these are still kind of object-oriented, not in the sense of object-oriented programming, but like, oh, well, this is like an author, a title, is like a basic bibliographic description. And then later on, like there's some attempt at doing some other kind of scholarship or asking question of what the relationships are between this resource and other resources. So trying to think about how could we represent that in a different way, particularly using some of the techniques of sort of linked data approaches. And right, we're also very focused on particular kinds of objects in our data models, and thinking about these as different layers of how we might represent some of the things that Therese and other scholars in her field are interested in. And so this is sort of like this idea that there are sort of these different layers of information that we might want to be trying to connect together. And that we have a lot of standards for representing these kinds of objects already. So we have standards like friend of a friend and something called encoded archival context, corporations, people, and families. Or we have ontologies for organizations. Or we have ways of representing different conceptual schemas and taxonomies. And we can describe artifacts using metadata standards like Dublin Core. So then, we could, if we have an object, if we have a document, we could just use Dublin Core to describe it. But that doesn't solve the problem of trying to draw this ecology. So then thinking a little bit about what John Unsworth calls scholarly primitives. So what do humanities scholars often do with these resources is that oftentimes they're doing things like annotation or other kinds of description or definition or identification. And again, as Therese was saying, is sometimes these things and these descriptions that we create are created out of our own way of working, that we are optimizing Dublin Core records or MARC records for information retrieval tasks, not for answering scholarly questions in the humanities. We are doing encoded archival description partly as a way for us to be able to maintain and organize and manage this large collection of manuscript material that's in the archive. And I think I'll talk a little bit later about some of our methods, but one of the people we were talking about was giving us an example of trying to find and identify some of these women pedagogues. And in the archival finding aid, they were all listed according to their husbands' names, which actually was not all that untraditional of a practice for different kinds of directories. So you're not a woman, you're Mrs. So-and-so. And so unless you knew what her husband's name was, you wouldn't be able to search and find her. And I'm not necessarily maybe a critique of the archive, but that might have been the way that the material had been organized in the original record. So how can we reconceptualize, how can we borrow and build on these kinds of bibliographic databases or archival data, but recontextualize and represent them in the context of the scholarship that we want to try to do? So part of the fun we've had is also trying to understand interstices, and I think Therese comes at it from a different question. But for me, in some ways, there are these different layers, and then there are the spaces between them, because these things aren't necessarily connected even in our systems. So you go to the catalog to search for books, you go over here to the journal database, and those two things aren't necessarily connected. And maybe there's something over here in Google Books. Also how about some of these things of using linked data is a way to fill in those spaces between these different metadata systems. Again, with those connections oriented towards serving the kind of scholarship that is happening in rhetoric and composition, which was also fascinating for me, So I'm in LIS, I'm pretty grounded in archival studies literature, museum studies, things like that. To discover this whole other body of literature within rhetoric and composition scholarship, talking about archives and things that I'm concerned about is fascinating. Of course, I don't have enough time to read all of it, but it's been fascinating because they are coming at these questions also from a very different mindset and perspective that I think putting those two sets of literature into conversation is something we've been talking about doing. The other thing that in terms of initially countering the project of seeing some of these sort of pretty straightforward kind of descriptions, this is sort of this idea of semantics in metadata relationships. And we can think of things having sort of kind of weak semantics all the way up to very kind of strong semantics. And this is part of this shift going from a simple flat MARC record in terms of the data structure. But what's in there is actually a lot of really interesting relationships that we can't necessarily take advantage of until we start representing it in other kinds of languages that make those connections more clear. So thinking about how some of these ways that we want to connect and represent things like mobility. So what if we move away from a model that's just describing a static document that has some intrinsic properties and we might want to classify it in particular ways, but that doesn't tell me necessarily about its relationships to documents that might live elsewhere, or that it might be part of a trajectory of someone in their career. So can we use some of these new tools to move beyond just that description to represent some of these other kinds of things? And if you do a lot of data modeling, don't look too closely at this, kind of squint at it. And right, so getting away from just like, okay, we're going to have a record for this document, to thinking about people, resources, collections of resources, and maybe organizations and institutions that people are affiliated with. And that this then becomes more of the ecological model that Therese is sort of after, in thinking about these kind of relationships. And then, right, then maybe we also want some place to put the kind of scholarship and annotation that is part of this. And we're not the only ones trying to do this. I'm just going to show you a couple of different projects that we've also been using as sort of inspiration. This is the Linked Jazz project. So right, let's take all the different jazz performers. Again, a lot of these people are already represented in authority databases from libraries, but their relationships, they're just an entity. There's a person, there's a name, maybe there's some basic data about when they were born, where they were born, and things like that. But no information about how they're related to other performers. So now, using linked data, I can start talking about influence, who performed with each other, who co-wrote with each other, who was a drummer in a band for somebody else, who and how. What are all these different kinds of relationships? And so then you can start drawing these kinds of networks. This actually was interesting because one of the things that's not often directly, explicitly in authority data is a person's gender. So then you could add that information, and that's what this visualization is. It looks a little bit like that Nate Silver map that's been going around, where there's a little bit of pink in here. But this also tells us a little bit about some of the biases, perhaps, in the authority data, that right now it's mostly men and a very small number of women. But now we can have that view. And maybe this is now also a place where we can identify some of those gaps where there's an opportunity for a recovery project about, okay, where are the women in jazz here? And maybe they've also fallen through the cracks in some of the ways that we approach constructing some of our own controlled vocabularies. This is another disciplinary project called the Writing Studies Tree. Right, this is also an example of the danger of like just going into this for the computational technique is, yep, that's a tree of some sort, or maybe a shrubbery. But I don't know what it tells us. Like, there are ways to drill down in this where you can then look at an individual and see relationships and stuff like that. But this was sort of like a quick snapshot that I could show you.
I have a lot of problems with that tool.
Right, but this is also grounded in a particular technique, which is sort of an example of the kind of disciplinary project that often happens, is that this basically network diagram is based on the idea of an academic genealogy. Right, so you were telling us who you worked with Donald Case, and so like that is one of these people's sort of great grandfather in terms of your academic stuff. So right, so you can then trace back and say, how many students has Mia trained, and sort of visualize that. And again, this is sort of a crowdsourced tool where people are coming in and adding this data, so it's not necessarily complete. But it has this academic genealogy orientation, which also covers up some of these kinds of things that LWP is interested in. At the same time, there's another project called Social Networks and Archival Context. So right, if you go and look at an authority list from libraries, there's sort of this idea of literary warrant. The way you get an authority record is you have to publish something that gets cataloged by a library, usually some sort of monograph thing or other kind of thing. And a lot of people who are represented in archival collections, there might be one letter from this person, and that's not enough warrant to get an authority record in something like VIAF or another thing. So what SNAC is trying to do is create that kind of authority list for people who might have occasional appearances in archival collections. Now, some of these people also have publications or are well known, so if I go look for Thomas Jefferson, I can see all kinds of things. But this is also trying to capture some of those lower level things. So this is just an example that one of the things in rhetoric and composition is this conference on college composition and communication. So basically, this is pulling from some of those sources. So we don't have any much information here. But we do, if we went and clicked over here, we would find some other related resources. So there's 29 resources and one person. But this also shows the sort of paucity of some of the kinds of things that we're concerned with, because no one has really worked on this particular area. And SNAC is sort of like a pilot project right now. This is one of those interesting sort of digital humanities library crossover kinds of things too. Right, so if I go look for that one person, I find out that it's this Mariana Davis. I can look at this kind of radial network and look at the relationships between this collection and this individual. And then I can also see, now we actually have some biographical notes and some information, maybe some relation to other people, other kinds of resources. So now I have a way of sort of looking and seeing these connections and navigating to new places. And Therese, I don't know if you want to jump in on some of this part too, in terms of what we're doing now and okay. And we can figure out if we need to share the mic somehow. Right, so that's sort of like the data part of this, and that's part of the reason I first got interested. So part of also I should mention the way we got interested, and I haven't forwarded this email to you, but Therese also runs something in the spring called Digital Scholars, and it's a 1-credit seminar through the English department where we take up digital humanities topics. It's actually an open seminar, so other people, other faculty from across campus come and participate and present and stuff like that. So that's partly how we found each other, is through this sort of informal kind of thing. And right, what attracted me at first was sort of some of this kind of data modeling, linked data stuff. As we prepared this sort of collaborative grant for the Council of Research and Creativity here at FSU, we also, in a lot of the mid-map stuff, Therese had always been talking about it being a crowdsourced thing, that this is the kind of work that she's never going to be able to do it all herself, or even with a cadre of graduate students helping her. This has to be something that's sort of more of a community-based thing. So there was always this idea of doing crowdsourcing. Well, there's sort of like dead crowdsourcing projects all over the place, because the idea that, oh, we're just going to crowdsource and people will come and source doesn't necessarily hold up. And the really successful crowdsourcing projects are ones that have been very carefully tailored to engage people, to get them directed towards what it is that they should be contributing and how they can contribute and what their contribution means. So as part of the grant project, we built in a participatory design project where we could start engaging with other scholars who we think are the kinds of people we want contributing to it, in part so what we build will meet their needs and be something that they would want to use. So this gets to some of what we were talking about earlier about user experience stuff and how it can also get applied in this kind of DH environment. Oh, right, I should have had this slide up. In our grant, we said we're going to build a participatory platform to enable historians to collaboratively chart the migration of intellectual contributions of North American women pedagogues. Right, this is grant language, right, very specific. Nationally and transnationally from aggressive era to the middle 20th century. What this has looked like is that we have a 3-part method that we're using. First of all, we did some semi-structured interviews. This is pretty straightforward stuff that you probably all know about. That we talked to scholars, particularly a number of senior scholars who have worked specifically in this area of research of the history of rhetoric and scholarship. And when we first started talking about these, Therese sort of presented them as sort of like, oh, these are sort of senior scholars, and they probably haven't really done any digital projects. And I think that's kind of was accurate. But one of the things that I was really fascinated with is every single one of them said, the access, it's a digital deluge that you were talked about, like the access to digitized documents, Google Books, digitized archives has fundamentally changed how they go about doing their research. It has not, however, fundamentally changed some of the ways they go about doing their research in terms of taking notes. Right, in the past, there was a lot of handwritten stuff because the archives wouldn't let you take a computer or a camera or anything in with you. But now you can go all kinds of places, and you can do things. Instead of writing analog notes, now it's just a big giant Word document with all my notes in it, and maybe some semi-structured spreadsheets and other kinds of things that I might use, or things like Zotero, which was sort of initially intended to replace that box of index cards that I used to carry around with me. So what is data in the digital humanities is one of those questions that we didn't talk too much about earlier, but so what does it mean for you to have data? And what data they have is sort of kind of unstructured notes. And the way they collaborate with people is often very informal, either through email. You see someone who has a publication, you can email them, or you run into people at conferences and you have those great hallway conversations. This is partly one of those things I think we temporarily put on the table, but as much as this is a project about those entities that we talked about, how much of this is also a community that is mutually supporting people in a shared area of research?
I do want to say, I think many of them were near the end of their careers, and it was so clear that they weren't interested in collaborating. but by and large, the field is really a very collaborative field because it's intimate. But I think the particular participants were so near the end; they're in their twilight years, and it clearly, that wasn't a driver for them.
Well, or it's like, you have a mentoring relationship with students you're the chair of their committee, and there's that kind of collaboration too. So particularly these people who are on the twilight of their careers and often have aggregated a large amount of material, some of which is they've only published the tip of the iceberg out of that research that they did. And they'd be happy to share their stuff, but they don't have the time to enter it into a database or share it in any particular way. So, identify this sort of really interesting problem and need that we might need to accommodate through this interview. We did a participatory design round where I used something called Stormboard. I'm trying to figure out how to use this instead of the awful whiteboard in Collaborate, because it's really awesome. But basically, it sort of is a virtual collaborative whiteboard, just the way Google Documents, you can see each other and edit together. It's basically just a big open white space where you can put. Yeah. Unusual behavior, that's right. This group of people were people who had developed some digital scholarship, often in rhetoric and composition, but not necessarily in the area of feminist historiographies or women pedagogues. But they'd had some experience doing that kind of project management. They developed some data sets. We thought they would be a good group to sort of talk about developing our tool. Maybe we could learn some things from them. So we did a brainstorming, a scenario development, and then some wireframing. I do want to say, sort of as a quick side note, in doing participatory design, the whole sort of ethos of that is that I'm not doing the design, we're all working together. And so there becomes this question about, well, traditionally when I did the semi-structured interviews, everybody was confidential. I'm not going to tell anybody about who said what. But that's a little bit different than this ethos. And so we actually, in our IRB, built it in so that participants could self-select. So we would like to thank all of our participants in agreeing to do it. And everyone decided not to be confidential. They chose to be co-designers. So we have to give their credit where credit is due. Through this process, we found a couple of things. I think we validated some of the basic ideas we had about the kinds of entities we're interested in. We learned about how scholars collect and organize their research, which sort of validated some of the things we learned in the semi-structured interview. Even for the people who are developing data sets, while there were some people who actually had a tangible data product at the end of it, a lot of the process behind it was still kind of unstructured. I was looking for the person who had the big bucket of data, who was just going to give it to us, and then we could process it, but that is few and far between. Well, but with a lot of linked data projects, there is data. There is all the authority data. I'm going to take that data, I'm going to do some augmentation to it, and then I can draw that nice visualization. But that's one of the interesting things in terms of this being a recovery project, is the data is not just laying around for us to go around and collect. So now it becomes about how do we build a process and a platform to support that recovery effort in a dispersed, distributed way. We also raised some questions about what it is that this platform that we're building will do natively versus how much this is sort of like embedded into the cloud of other kinds of things that are going on. So where do we store the data? Are we going to take copies of digitized documents and store them, or are we going to rely on their existence in some other project? Those are some questions I don't think we've completely satisfactorily answered. There's a lot of brittleness when you start relying on things that are in someone else's control. But at the same time, I don't know how big a repository. And then it gets to that question of persistence of like, are we going to be a long-term repository for these things, or is there a better way to handle that? Also, the data needs to be portable. People might be willing to participate in this, but if it's a dead end and they can't get the data out to do other things, no one's going to want to use it. But at the same time, that's good for some people who knew some of these technical tools, but for some other people, they wanted the platform to be able to also give them some pre-built ways of doing analysis and visualization. This also helped us think a little bit about what we might actually do, right? So Therese talked a little earlier about having a WordPress blog and trying to think of some other ways about how we do data entry and things like that. And right, so if we do a really structured data modeling thing and have a really tight data model, we can do things like forms and things like that. But in part because the data is often very unstructured and we don't know what all the possible stuff is, the questions that different people are going to be asking are maybe different than the ones that we have. So how do we build an extensible platform that might allow different ways of collaborating and interacting? So right, we might still keep the WordPress blog for some of the sort of, this is the project, but now looking at things like what originally was called Semantic Wiki and is now called Wikibase, which allows you to sort of use a wiki-like structure to build linked data information. And then think about later about some of the analysis tools, about how do we extract structured information out of some of this, and then build analysis tools that are tailored to the kinds of questions that either Therese wants to ask or other people come to the project with. And right, in collaboration with the participants, we also build a set of wireframes. So right, we sort of did a brainstorming session. What's important to you? What kinds of projects are you working on? What do you think we should be thinking about? Let's talk about some scenarios about how you might use those things or go about answering some of those questions. And then showing them some things, in part to validate that we had heard what they were saying correctly. And I think that people were generally pretty excited about what the direction we were headed. That I think hasn't been encouraging. And right, in part, this is also as a small bit of funding from FSU designed to get us to the next level so we can go to NEH or another funding agency to, now we have this really nice set of wireframes to say, we've thought through all of these issues, and now we have a much better sense of how we're going to actually go about building this platform. Right, so there's some different things. I'm not going to talk through these for the sake of time, but we can come back to them later. That was mostly what we did over the summer. It was really great, but as you know, doing sort of semi-structured things, we did 3 one-hour sessions with folks. That took a fair amount of our time this summer. We had a second round planned that had been intended to be a little bit more hands-on, but we actually kind of moved it a little bit to be more of an asynchronous activity that is modeled on what we did real time with people. So we're using Qualtrics, but we're using Qualtrics as a participatory design instrument, not as sort of a survey. So you can do these things with hotspots. So you can show people the interface and sort of give them an opportunity to sort of say, oh yeah, I like that, or I don't like that. And then we're going to ask them some of the same kinds of questions of like, well, what would you do with this? How would you use this? How does this fit with your research and scholarship, in order to sort of get a little bit broader set of feedback from people. And now this is the sort of open-ended part of it. I don't know if, Therese, if you would like to take the first shot at this, or we can sort of...
No, I actually just wanted to say, throughout all these discussions, we've had to think about what is the ideal DH collaboration, mainly because it's been so hard to get resources to support this work. It's hard to find a place. It's hard to get money. It's hard to sometimes help administrative structures understand the nature of a cross-disciplinary project.
I get so nervous with the mic. And so we identified that factors in the ideal DH collaboration are mindsets and methods. We've actually spent quite a lot of time discussing that. What we have not had a chance to come up with is our dream list of resources and structures. So I offered this as a final slide, just not knowing whether our discussion might go that way. But so there is sort of that, and we also have not had time to document this process, which is a terrible thing. If ever you're going to do anything, you need to make sure there's time to document everything you're doing and every realization that comes of it, and that's where we've fallen short. So I see these as very reflective questions that we haven't had a chance to really unpack, but they're important, so I wanted to just throw them up there, those 4 facets of doing a DH collaboration. Maybe one other thing I'll say is, and no, let's just open it up to questions. Why don't I just not talk anymore?
I don't know, what's the best way to do questions for the mic? Is there another mic to float around?
Just pass it around, okay.
Okay, repeat the question, I presume.
So I come from public management perspective, so lots of different perspectives here. Someone who is, a lot of women, not surprisingly, have been very interested in aspects of management for a very long time, but like many of the women you described, have sort of been underneath aspects of the literature and the knowledge that's been created. Someone who's sort of risen to the fore somehow is someone by the name of Mary Parker Follett. Huh. And it might be interesting to just see how she's sort of, the dust has been blown off of her work, and she's sort of been uncovered and risen to some level of prominence within management literature. She wrote back she wrote about the Speaker of the House back in the late 1890s, and so, and then she moved into management and was really sort of a very forward-thinking person about the role of people in management.
Yeah, that's interesting.
So
I will look into her.
It might be interesting to see how her progression is sort of as far as how she became known.
Right.
Right, and some of the ways in which that happened.
That,
may be helpful, may not.
well, I mean, I also do some work in institutional history, and it's just been fascinating looking at the evolution of the American university in the last 100 years. So I can already imagine that would give great insight into sort of some of the shifts towards professionalization and why some agents or people might be more visible. So yeah, thank you for that.
Well, with the humanism component of management, that's a traditional area for management.
Right. Yeah, ethics. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you.
And just, I guess, quickly about the folks who are in the twilight of their careers
Yeah.
and their interest in collaboration. Part of that could be the culture that they came out of, right? I think it could be argued that the academe there's an emphasis on collaboration that really wasn't there.
Oh yeah, I meant that not as a generalization.
No.
That was, the thing is, my field is necessarily so collaborative. It's already a cross-disciplinary field between humanities and social sciences, and it's fairly small. So the particular scholars we talked to were known to just have this great ethic of mentoring. And so it was interesting to me to see, when we were presenting them with that scenario, what set of tools would you like to have in place, or what kinds of tasks or activities. It was insightful for me to see these same people back away from that, and really to cite reasons, I think along the lines of Kay might have said, I'm just not interested in the discipline anymore. She's already just doing other kinds of, like writing books about whales or something. I don't know. I mean, the shift was so stark, yeah, absolutely. There are a lot of reasons underlying certain kinds of engagement. And they were very traditionally trained scholars, but were very collaborative.
Wow, that's interesting.
And that's just by nature of the field. And then if you work in feminist historiography, you have to be collaborative. So these, in fact, were some of the women who founded the Coalition of Feminist Scholars, which the organization existed simply to, first and foremost, to raise the professional status of women in the university. And then it moved towards innovating historical methodologies. And it started out being a group that was interested in women's uplift, and now it looks quite a lot more at other groups that might fall under alterity labels. Yeah.
Excellent, thank you.
Yeah.
I don't know if this is kind of related, but what struck me is when you're looking at contributions of women historically. Do you think the same challenges exist moving forward, depending on what discipline you're involved in? For example, we're very mindful about establishing a web presence and joining things like ResearchGate and
Yeah.
but maybe less so in the humanities. Like moving forward, do you think that this would be as much of a problem for tracing contributions, whether gender-wise or what have you? Given just differences in the field and how we represent ourselves electronically, digitally, or via the web.
If you're posing the question about your own field, I don't know that I could answer that. Richard might.
Well, I mean, I think there's always this question of archival silences about what makes it into the archives. And I think there's this question now about, well, I think what's interesting in terms of our semi-structured people, of also, they were mostly of a generation where, right, where you did things is you had a bulletin board or a place on the web to go, or a particular listserv. And, as someone who formerly managed a listserv, like the traffic took a nosedive after we all moved onto Facebook and Twitter, and now it's like that distributed community. So in some ways, I think that, right, someone who mentors through those social media platforms as a figure in the field, like those kinds of interactions may be in danger of being lost. In part, particularly if we do our job and teach people about locking down their profiles and things like that, those interactions may not end up in the archive. For some of the same ways that these other kinds of things don't, if you're in between those disciplinary structures that get archived, that record will be missing. I don't know if we've specifically thought about this in terms of this project, but yeah.
Could we also be moving from the famine problem to the feast
Yeah,
problem,
yeah.
right? I mean, that there's just so much out there that unless it's weighty enough, meaty enough, right, it might not rise to the fore. I don't.
Yeah, I think abundance is a good critical problem. It's a real
Right,
problem.
right.
It's such a problem.
Right.
It's not just a nice thing, it's a problem.
Well, when people use words like deluge and tsunami, it's not necessarily a great thing.
Right, yeah. And I'm not so sure I buy. I mean, I have a hard time with the spatial humanists who really do narrate history as if all the data came out in the 90s and then all of a sudden we had all these critical problems. So I don't know that I quite buy into, that modernist narrative. But it certainly is a narrative that dictates how people in my field understand data. Sorry. I'm done. And maybe on that note, one of the things I do want to say, and this was very clear to me when Richard was showing one slide, I can't quite remember which one, maybe the stacks, when you were showing the stacks. There is actually a huge body of research in archival sciences and practice, archival theory and practice is called, that comes out of Ret Comp, and that actually comes out of rhetorical studies, because that's our main research methodology. And so often we have cognates, some of us are certified, we end up doing a lot of archival processing, but at the same time we're being trained as critical theorists. And so therein you have that dual approach that we do want to build the archives, but we do honestly believe that any archive will deconstruct, if you ask the right question towards it. And so perhaps one of the differences in our disciplinary orientation when we're building this tool is I'm interested in output, and Richard has good insight into input. Like, how do you create the tool so that input is good? And I'm always skipping over that step, saying I just want output. I just want to get to the point where we can create data visualizations or something that will require a lot of interpretation so that a researcher can ask and answer a question. And so that's been a really interesting realization for me, and I'm not so sure I see that discussion in our field literature, or even in I don't know, even in archival studies. Just the idea that you can come at it with different expectations. Of the tool has to be immaculate so that it really is reading and scraping the right sources, and so that's where poor Richard has probably felt like I've been fighting him, because I go, I don't care, because the information will come from people. But, he has really been giving me the education, saying, no, that you have to care about that. And I've always been asking about output. So that's been an interesting, yeah. I don't know that I've ever said I don't care, but that has been an interesting realization I think we wanted to write about. We haven't found time to do that.
And I think the other thing is about, right, I was already sort of keyed into this whole mindsets thing, but a lot of it's also about listening and stopping to make sure that we're talking about the same things. I think particularly because there is this other tradition of talking about archives in Ret Comp. Sometimes we think we're talking about the same things, and maybe we go a couple rounds and we're like, okay, wait a minute.
We're way off.
Maybe we need to stop and say, do we really mean the same thing here when we're talking about this? And then share our own expertise about it so that we can develop, in some cases, a shared understanding of what it is we're working on. I don't know, maybe go ahead.
You mentioned the challenges for identifying resources, funding. So where have you identified? Where is it?
I can't tell you how many grant narratives we've written that have gotten rejected. Maybe this is the first year we took a year off. We tried with the ACLS, we tried with the NEH, Office of Digital Humanities. I tried with my own discipline, and they kept rejecting this as research. So that process of going out and finding funding is one I haven't been able to solve. I think one of the reasons why we decided to define the study this way is we thought that participatory design was a nice concrete way of demonstrating what a cross-disciplinary project could look like, because somehow the funding agencies weren't getting the cross-disciplinarity, or maybe our questions weren't clear. So I think we're still looking for those sources, to be honest. There is going to be a special issue of DHQ, Digital Humanities Quarterly, in 2018 that focuses on invisible work in the digital humanities, and I think we'll see if we can, I think we're planning on responding to that call. We actually, one facet of the LWP project is a blog where we're drafting what we call intellectual encounters. So this is an interesting methodology that I think has emerged as fairly native to this project, or maybe we should call it a primary methodology, thinking about John's terminology. And it's exciting to me because it's an opportunity for us to write up in 1,000 or 1,500 words some of our particular data challenges and then to illustrate them. And so we did that because I thought it would be nice to at least have that material somewhere and have an author's name tied to it. So Richard will draft one, I'll draft one, our other collaborators will draft them. But I think I'm still looking. Yeah, I don't know that I've found them. Yeah.
Well, I think the other thing that this process under the current internal funding has given us is now we might have a much better sense of that totality of what we think we need to build now. That another approach that we might take is, what's the roadmap for building this out, and how do you slice it into pieces and go after funding for that piece? Because on one hand, this is a big project to get single funding for, but if you can explain a piece of it in clearer terms, it may sail through a process better.
I might add also, we had some frank conversations with Brett Bobley, who still oversees the Office of Digital Humanities at the NEH, and it was very clear to me that he's supportive of a lot of different projects, but his mindset in terms of what makes a good DH collaboration was still very different. And he seemed to indicate that funding would go towards things like symposia, seminars, conversations. And so they had a grant structure that I think it's changed. I don't know if innovation is the word now or advancement, but advancement. And so it's often been hard to determine at what phase is this project. Are we startup? Are we level 1? Are we level 2? So that's been part of the challenge as well, is just watching their grant structures change and rearticulate and having to decide where do we fit in their understanding of of how a project is developed.
Well, and I think they're also interested in things that are generalizable too, like that it's a tool that's built to solve some general problems in the humanities, not a particular research question. So the question becomes like, if we put this package together, how do you then turn it into something that someone who's interested in a different area can take advantage of the features that it has? And that also then is, what parts do we build? What parts do we build on top of other projects? There's some of the questions we have to answer.
Well, we'd like to thank you for your time. Thank you, Therese.
Let me pull up there is also a symposium that's going to be happening.
That's right. Don't forget it.
That is in November, November 17th to the 18th. That's going to explore some of these topics. And it gets to some of the things we were talking about earlier in our session about what are some of the models for how this work happens and who gets credit for it and where does this work happen. So that's partly what some of this is going to explore. We're bringing in a number of speakers to talk about DH centers, how DH work gets done, and some other things.
Yeah, please come. Registration is free. Food is provided.
Food.
Yes, all meals will be provided. Very good menus. Please come.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.